With 6 wives and over 500 concubines, Genghis Khan left a staggering mark on the world's genetic makeup. Today, around 16 million men, 0.5% of the global male population, are linked to him. But his rise to power was drenched in blood and cruelty. Temujin's early life was nothing short of tragic. Born into a minor tribe, his father was poisoned by a rival, leaving young Temujin and his family abandoned by their own people. They were forced to fend for themselves in the unforgiving Mongolian plains. But hardship made Temujin stronger. Through sheer determination and cunning, he rose from being a tribal outcast to the unifier of the Mongolian steppe. Temujin knew that tribal loyalties were fleeting, and so he began to build his empire not on blood ties, but on loyalty and skill. Under his leadership, the Mongol army became a deadly force, using speed, mounted archery, and devastating tactics to crush anyone in their path. But behind every victory, there was a gruesome aftermath. Cities were destroyed, men were slaughtered, and women, they were taken, never to return to the lives they once knew. The name Genghis Khan often evokes images of unstoppable armies, vast empires, and ruthless conquest. But what many people don't know is how this legendary Mongol ruler treated the millions of slaves under his control. Genghis Khan may have been a military genius, but his rule was as merciless for his subjects as it was for his enemies. The fate of captured slaves. Imagine being conquered by an army where defeat didn't just mean losing your home, your family, or even your life. It meant becoming property, and not just any property, but a disposable asset in the hands of one of the most feared men in history. Genghis Khan's empire stretched across Asia and into Europe, making it the largest land empire ever established. At the height of his power, the Mongols ruled over more than 100 million people. But it wasn't just soldiers and citizens who were part of this vast dominion. Thousands, possibly even millions, of men, women, and children were taken captive as slaves, forced into a life of servitude that was often brutal, terrifying, and dehumanizing. For Genghis Khan, slaves weren't just prisoners of war. They were resources to fuel his conquests, support his elite, and expand his empire. But what exactly did life look like for someone under Genghis Khan's iron grip? Now let's take a deeper look at the harsh realities of life as a slave under Genghis Khan. First and foremost, slaves in the Mongol Empire were seen as little more than tools. They were expected to perform backbreaking labor, from constructing fortresses and roads to building the very war machines that would be used in future battles. The Mongol war machine depended on this forced labor, as slaves were the backbone of the empire's massive infrastructure projects. Slaves were often assigned the most grueling and dangerous tasks, and their lives were treated as completely expendable. In fact, Mongol leaders, including Genghis Khan, believed that the life of a slave had no intrinsic value. Only the work they could produce mattered, and when they were no longer able to work, they were discarded, either left to die or executed. But the brutality didn't stop at the sheer physical labor. Punishments for disobedience or attempts to escape were unimaginably cruel. Slaves were frequently beaten, tortured, and mutilated to serve as examples to others. In some cases, it's said that Genghis Khan's commanders would execute entire groups of slaves to instill fear in the rest, ensuring total obedience. One particularly gruesome method involved tying disobedient slaves behind horses and dragging them across the rugged terrain until they died. The Mongols had perfected the art of psychological control, using terror to keep their captives submissive. Perhaps the most terrifying fate for slaves, though, was being used as human shields on the battlefield. When Genghis Khan's army went to war, slaves were often marched to the front lines, facing the brunt of enemy attacks before the Mongol soldiers even engaged in combat. This tactic ensured that enemy forces exhausted their weapons on the slaves, clearing the way for the Mongol army to strike with full force. Even after his death, the leaders who followed continued these practices, embedding them into Mongol society. His generals and successors learned well from him, using the same brutal methods to conquer new lands and subjugate more people. The fate of captured women. When Genghis Khan's army conquered a new city, the spoils were not limited to treasures or lands. Women became part of the loot, ripped from their families, and sent to Genghis Khan's camp. The fate of these women varied. Some were taken as wives by high-ranking Mongol warriors, while others were handed off as gifts or sold into slavery. But for the most beautiful, their fate was sealed. They were sent directly to Genghis Khan himself. For Genghis Khan, this wasn't just about satisfying his desires. He used women as a political tool, marrying off women from conquered tribes to cement alliances or maintain peace. But the process was far from consensual. Women were seen as commodities, traded, abused, and discarded. He violated women in order to psychologically break their families and enemies. The Mongol slave system also influenced the rise of other empires that followed in their footsteps. As the Mongol Empire expanded, it established trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. One of the key commodities traded along these routes, human beings. The Mongols actively participated in and expanded the international slave trade, which would later be adopted by other empires. The brutal practices introduced by Genghis Khan and his successors contributed to the normalization of slavery as an economic and military tool. Other civilizations, like the Ottoman Empire and certain European powers, learned from the Mongol example, seeing slavery as an essential component in their quest for domination. Not just the human toll, but the environmental and societal ruin caused by Mongol invasions and their use of forced labor. Entire communities were decimated, their lands stripped of resources, their populations either enslaved or massacred. The ripple effect of these beliefs can be seen in many of the world's most oppressive systems of the past and present, from colonialism to modern-day slavery and exploitation.